Today, we'll start by the third item of the BEPS that we were asked to talk about, and this is undervaluation of mineral export. So, undervaluation of mineral export, basically, there's three issues when you want to evaluate exports. First one is the quantities, to make sure that the quantities being exported are really the quantities reported to the tax authority. The second one is qualities, because minerals do not have the same value, and very often minerals are sold as concentrate. And depending on the level of concentration, the value of the mineral of the export will differ. And lastly, it's basically a transfer pricing problem. How do you make sure that the prices that are being used for the transaction are real arm's length prices? Especially, as we discussed yesterday, many of these transactions are made with related parties. This is again the issue of undervaluation of the price when it's sold to a related party. So what happened is that there's a profit shifting via the pricing of mineral products sold to related party that will be located in low tax jurisdiction. One of the issues is the lack of mineral testing facilities. So government don't know exactly what is being sold and exported. So there needs to be a sector-specific knowledge in terms of how the transformation process, the refining, the smelting is taking place to get to the final product. And this is something that the Ministry of Finance will need the help of the Ministry of Mines and Petroleum to be able to do that. What are the ways that, in terms of price, mining company can under-evaluate? Underquoting prices to say that the selling price are not the real ones. Misspecifying reference prices to take, and this is the case in petroleum, because as you probably know, there's two main markets for petroleum, Brent and WTI, West Texas Intermediate, and the two don't have necessarily the same price. And petroleum is not a fully uniform product. There's probably 40 different types of petroleum, in terms of whether if it's sweet, if it's light. There's this index API, whether petroleum is light or heavy petroleum. So depending on the quality of the petroleum, depending of the amount of sulfur in petroleum, different sites, petroleum field will have different value for their petroleum. So you have to make sure that if you take reference prices, that you're using the right type of petroleum as a comparison. You will also have, and I put a practical example taken from a contract, I think in this presentation or later, about all the price and adjustment, deduction, handling fee, marketing fee, insurance, freight. So there may be quite a few deductions that the company wants to make to reduce the value of its commodity to be taxes or for calculation of the royalty. Not declaring the, misrepresenting the level of concentration. I mentioned yesterday the example of lithium, which is, I like this example because a change of concentration from 5% to 6% increased the value by 30% of the lithium concentrate. So I like this example because just a small difference in concentration will lead to a huge adjustment in prices. So it's important to make sure that what is being exported, if the company declares that it's 5% and they get paid for 5% lithium in terms of concentration, that actually the price, the value of what is exported should be based on 6% lithium. And this is the same thing for various metals. Not declaring the presence of valuable byproducts. For instance, copper often comes with some gold in it. The copper concentrate is exported for final smelting. The smelter will recover a certain quantity of gold, which has quite a big, because gold has a big value, which represent quite a high value that should be also taxed by the authorities. I worked some years ago in Haiti, in the Caribbean, and they had a huge copper mine in the 70s and 80s there. And they were producing copper, but also a significant amount of gold. And it's only after many years that at some point the Minister of Mines was in a conference in Texas. And someone told him, who said, oh, you're from Haiti, we're buying gold that comes from Haiti, my company. And he says, this is interesting because we're not producing gold. And actually for years that company was exporting gold, along with copper, and they never told the government. And the government didn't have proper control in place. So this gold was exported and with no revenue whatsoever for the government. Inflating the presence and level of impurities, that the quantities being exported, the company will say that there's a high level of impurities, so that reduces the value. And this is this is present when we talk about the qualities, the intrinsic qualities of a commodity. Example like coal has various qualities that will impact the prices. So I just did a very simple. I took actually it's from the OECD handbook. So I took an example where with copper, because besides coal, I try to use copper and coal because you're producing quite a bit of copper and coal. So I'm looking at a case which technically they're comparable in terms of function, asset, and risk of the parties. The copper is exported, by shipment of 20,000 tons, metric ton. There's 50 shipments per year. Each shipment contains 31% of copper by weight and 4 grams of gold. So there's a byproduct of gold per ton. Adjustment to the gross value of cargo are made for losses during smelting. 1% for copper, 1 gram for gold. Production costs assumed to be $1.70 per pound of copper, which is the midpoint for copper producers. Royalty rates, copper 3.5% at Valorem royalties, gold 5% of gold value, and the corporate income tax at 30%. Just to show you that rapidly, this would be if the sell at market prices to be fair. So here we have the price, the market prices. If you underprice the copper by 10%, the revenue goes down to 31.1. And if we don't declare the gold, which and there's many cases, I just mentioned the one about Haiti, but there's many other places where it happened. So then the revenue, the value of the cargo is going further down to 32.7. So if you calculate the royalty with the underpriced copper and with without considering the gold, the royalty revenue goes from 1.7 to 1.5 million to 1.4. But the big impact comes from the corporate income tax. So if you take the revenue minus the cost minus the royalty payment, here is your base to calculate the corporate income tax that goes from 15.5 to 8.8. So the corporate tax at 30% goes from 4.6 to 2.6. So you lose 2 million on with corporate income tax. Per shipment, the loss of revenue goes from 6.3 to 4, and you lose over $2 million per shipment in terms of royalty revenue and in terms of corporate income tax. So this is a simple example, but just by an adjustment of 10% and just by not declaring the gold, which is not a huge quantity, I mean it's a few grams per ton, you see that you have per shipment a revenue loss of 2.2. And remember, in this case, the company was making 50 shipments per year. Just for one mine, the loss of revenue is over $100 million. So just to show that just like a 10% on the price, which is not very big, at the end of the year, we can represent quite a bit of losses, in terms of revenue for the government. Sometimes we're talking about reference prices, like the sixth method in terms of transfer pricing. The issue, and again, I have an example for you. It's if you take the price on the market, the London Metal Exchange, But then there's a transport, there's a smelting that's of the concentrate, which sometimes is done outside the country. Transport up to this point, and the net value at the mine. So here you have the price of gold, for instance. If you use a reference price, that is like at the London Metal Market, the price of gold today is $1,356. So you're using this price. But then you say, but you have to ship it outside of Mongolia, or to ship it to wherever you're shipping it. So you have to deduct the transport costs. You have to pay for the refining, and then you have to transport it from the mine to the refiner, to the smelter, which often can be outside of the country, as I said. So here, you may have a price of 1,300, but here, once you've deducted all these costs, the net back value at the mine will be much lower. And I have another graph. When I'm going to talk about fiscal design and the resource rent tax, I have a graph more precise about this, about the royalty. So, because you have to, and I haven't had to look at it, but I don't remember it, you have to be clear where does your royalty is applied. And again, I'll show you a specific case, because you have to be very precise where and what deductions are being allowed before calculating the royalty. It's much easier to, because you will deal more and more with petroleum, it's much easier for petroleum because it's to extract, it's not a concentrate, it's the oil. So you will make an evaluation of the value of the oil, but there's not different types of product in the oil you're going to export or something. So it's much easier to determine value for the oil than for minerals. And normally what country does for oil is that they do, and there's firms that are super specialized like this, they do what we call an essay. So an essay is a really evaluation. They take sample of the oil that you have for a specific site, and they look at the API, which is the American, is the gravity, is the density of your oil. They will determine the API, whether it's light or heavy. They will also see the amount of sulfur, because there's also sulfur in oil. But they will do a real analysis of what type of oil exactly you're extracting. Then they will look at in the market. So they will look at the market, and they will look here, and here there's probably 40. If you look at the north, at the Brent, there's probably 40 different of oil. There's the North Sea one. There's the Norway inland. So they will look at different types of oil, and they have that are being traded at what price. And they'll say, okay, your oil here, because of these characteristics, match this oil, the number 6. So they'll know that the reference price for your oil should be the specific market traded oil. So once this is done, at the beginning of the production of the field, basically, because the oil will be always the same oil, so basically you don't have to do like sampling all the time, because you define like really the nature of the product that you're exporting. So again, in minerals, they're not necessarily sold at the mine, in the mine mouth at the gate, so they're sold in the market further along the way. So show what I just explained, and compared to petroleum, in mines, there can be variation from shipment from time to time in terms of the quality of the ore, of the different other products, byproducts you will find in the shipment. So there may be differences between different mines, but also between even between shipments. So you almost need to do sampling all the time, which is less the case. So and your minerals can be sold, like the mining company can sell at different places, like the ore, like really the raw material, and we call it like directly shipped ore. So it's basically the product from the mine that is sold directly to the buyer without no further processing. So you can sell the mining company can sell really the raw production, the ore, or can sell concentrate and out of the mill, or really after like smelting and final refining. So the minerals can be sold at different stages in their process. To complicate the thing is that during the processing at the smelter, there may be different minerals coming from different sources that will be blended together for the processing. So at some point it becomes difficult to see, okay, what is the real net smelter return we get from this mine versus this other mine, because the material was actually blended for the processing. And this is even more complicated when part or this processing or transport is not an arm's length transaction. It's done by an affiliated company. So you may have transfer pricing issues at the processing stage. And sometimes it's very hard to quite a long time to establish like what should be the real processing cost. So all this leads to the fact that sometimes to determine a value, a net back value at the mine mouth can be difficult for tax authorities. To determine arm's length prices, it's more difficult, as I said before, for unrefined minerals than oil. So there's a lack of quoted price for unfinished mineral product. There's no market for like concentrate of copper or nickel or zinc or other. There's a market for final product, but for concentrate there's no liquid market. There's about no quoted market price for rarer finished minerals. Like if you talk about all what we call the rare earth minerals, like niobium, polonium, all these minerals are sold under long-term contract, which often are not public. So it's very difficult to have benchmark prices for certain minerals that are not very common. No clear method sometimes to address quality differences, or it's harder to monitor, going back to your question, in terms of the output, in terms of you need to take samples on a frequent basis. The transport cost adjustment can also be more difficult, and to keep like the quantities that are being sold. So if you compare to oil, for instance, oil you can have meters at the site. So what is actually extracted can be metered immediately. If the transportation is done by pipelines, you can have meters at different places at the pipeline as well. And then let's say that it goes to a port and it goes by ship. So you can know like the amount of tankers that actually leave the port. So you can also have a control here. And the reference prices, because you've done the assay, you know exactly what's the value of the product here. So it's much easier to control the value, the price, to control the quantities through metering at different points, and because of the assay, you know the quality that will determine the price. So here, just to show that if you look at the cost of producing 50 tons of ore at mine mouth, let's say the cost is $300. Then you add to produce crushed screens ore, so you crush the minerals into smaller pieces to have ore, so that the cost of this is 50. Then you have the cost to produce concentrate, so some smelting that you do, and so like rough smelting that costs like another 100. Then you have domestic transport to transport the concentrate, very often outside the country. Then you do the final smelting and refining, which will cost $350. And then you have to export this product, the refined products. That's another $100 for the transportation after it's refined, and maybe another $50. So at the end you have the London Metal Exchange price, which is 1,000. But the 1,000 is the addition of all these costs that you have. So if you apply, and depending where you apply the royalty, so if you use 2% at the net back from the first point you have on your chart, which is 200, the royalty would be 6. If you look at the value at the first point of sale in the country at the FOB, the Franco on board export price, the royalty can be range from 6 to 20 depending on the scale point. If you value mineral at the benchmark price, which is 1,000, the final price, your royalty system says it's based on the reference price at the London Metal Exchange, and the reference price here is 1,000. So your 2% royalty is 20. So in practice, you also have to be clear where your royalty is being applied, because you have like these various points where the value will differ from the final price here, 1,000, net back at the mine mouth, which is only 300. Choice of where do you do the valuation, normal metal of sale and sale point. Here you said that sometimes it's at the mine mouth, sometimes the point of export. The extent of the processing before sale, do you sell, like the Liberia case, we saw it's really like the raw material, the raw ore. Sometimes you sell, like in gold, many, gold companies, they don't do like the refined, the final gold bullion. They do the doré, which is like a 95% gold, and it's a refining company that does the final refining. So gold, so you have to know at which the extent of the processing, is it the final product or an intermediate product? Availability of bench prices for intermediate products. Some like copper concentrate, there's many, copper is most of the time sold as concentrate. So it's possible to find, even if it's an intermediate product, and it's not really listed on the London Metal Exchange because it's not the final product, you can sometimes find benchmark prices for intermediate product, size, importance of operation, extent of non-arm's length sales, and obviously, some here, I think, I'm quite impressed by your capacity. But I also work in Africa sometimes, and the capacity level is very, very low. So they cannot manage like very complex valuation methodologies because they just don't have the capacity. You may need to have different rules for different minerals or mine. Again, I think the method you have to use for coal is probably different than the one you should use for copper or gold, because coal has this various characteristics in the local market. So the idea, I think the ultimate objective is to make sure that you apply, something that is closer to arm's length prices to non-arm's length transactions. I think that's the most important. But someone mentioned advanced pricing agreement. Sometimes, in certain cases, it's probably better to have in advance to negotiate an advanced pricing agreement with the company, so you know exactly how the mineral will be valued. So, in conclusion, so for qualities and quantities, the importance of having physical audits, that you actually look at exactly what is being exported. And for this, you need obviously the technical expertise. You need to have a risk-based strategy for monitoring measurements, so you need to do the monitoring depending on the risk. If it's gold, I think you have to do the monitoring more closely. In Tanzania, in Africa, I worked with the Tanzania Mining Audit Agency, which played the role of monitoring. The first year they were in operation, they found 7 cases where gold was leaving the country without the government knowing. They found gold in warehouses, in airports. So the gold was going to leave the country totally unknown by the government. So it's important to have a monitoring system depending on the risk. Gold is easy to export because the quantities are not that big for a huge amount of value. So that's an important one. The role of custom. I work in a country where they were exporting precious stone, and I was sitting with the director at the mining department, and at some point someone came in and he signed a form, And I was curious. I said, "What is this?" He said, "It's to allow the export of precious stone." And I said, "Okay, I'm interested by that. What are the controls?" And actually, there was no control about what is signed for and what is going to leave the country. So there was a huge gap in their monitoring system. So customs should have a major role to make sure that what leaves the country has been accounted for by the government, Ministry of Mines and Petroleum, and the tax authorities. I think the point I just want to underline is the owner should be the taxpayer. The taxpayer should have the obligation to disclose any related party transaction, associated party transaction. So the obligation should be on the taxpayer. The obligation of the taxpayer to prove you that the price at which they're selling to a related party is a fair price. So the burden of the proof to start with should be on the taxpayer. Yesterday we discussed to have like penalties if taxpayer actually they don't produce a good or reasonable transfer pricing calculation. But the same thing with the sampling. I think if the company supply provides you with a sampling and it's being quite wrong, you do a counter evaluation of the sample and you realize the company has been so you should have very aggressive penalties in such a case. In some cases, I'm just thinking at your question again, in some cases I've seen where companies have the obligation to submit, to provide sampling results, but that have been verified by independent labs. So the cost of doing the verification is by the company, and the labs have to be independent. I mean, this is a very technical, in some ways, problem in terms of the valuation, the concentration, and so this is a topic that actually the Ministry of Mines should work with you to develop the strategies and the techniques to make sure that you're getting a good evaluation.